Hey everybody, one that always bored, never boring. At the time of publishing this review, I imagine HeroScape is weighing heavily on the minds of a lot of people. Unfortunately, not enough people. HeroScape is a tabletop skirmish game that has been out of production for around 12 years, and which Avalon Hill are currently in the process of attempting to crowdfund. That crowdfunding campaign has not been as successful as people would have hoped up to this point, and it looks like there won't be any new HeroScape going into production as a result of that campaign. The resurgence of HeroScape, albeit potentially briefly, encouraged me to dig out an old copy of HeroScape Marvel The Conflict Begins, which I've already reviewed in a previous video, and it also encouraged me to spend a bit of time taking a closer look at this, Magic the Gathering Arena of the Planeswalkers. This is a tabletop skirmish game from 2015, and to call it a spiritual successor to HeroScape would be somewhat inaccurate. It is basically HeroScape, but HeroScape with an additional layer of rules in the form of spells inspired by, unsurprisingly, Magic the Gathering. Yes, this is the unnatural hybrid of two game systems, the unholy union of a once popular miniatures game with a perennial money-spinning card game. And it didn't do very well. In 2016, the year after its release, there were two expansions, one of which was a standalone starter set, and then it quietly shuffled away. I'm not entirely sure why it failed to set the world alight. Maybe it didn't appeal to the old HeroScape crowd because it replaced the plastic terrain with cardboard tiles, or maybe it was because the units were coloured plastic rather than being pre-painted, or maybe it was the inclusion of the spell cards, which detracted from the purity of the original game system for HeroScapers while being far too simple to add sufficient depth to entice the Magic the Gathering crowd. Or maybe it was just a badly managed release that wasn't marketed well and which was canned before it had a chance to hit its stride. Regardless, it's dead now. You can still find the original core set on the secondary market for a good price. The other stuff is a little harder to get, and I don't think the core set on its own offers enough to make a purchase worthwhile. I'll get into that though. First, I will reiterate, despite being a game I should like, HeroScape has never really interested me. Arena of the Planeswalkers is pretty much the same game, and so I feel pretty much the same way about it, although controversial as it may be, I actually like this game more. But I'm getting ahead of myself, let's look inside the box. First you have your trays of miniatures. You get 5 Planeswalkers, these are your spellcasters and basically the player avatars on the board. They are pre-painted and they are shockingly bad. Even by the standards of bad pre-paints, they are bad. These are worse than the Marvel HeroScape pieces, worse than my Mage Knight board game pieces, and far worse than my Lord of the Rings tradable miniatures game pieces. But you will notice that the rest of the miniatures in the set aren't painted at all, except for a few that I used as test subjects for a paint scheme many moons ago. They are just colour coded to match the colour of their respective Planeswalkers. You get 10 units in total, 2 each of red, blue, green, black and white. And that's really the first problem with this set. It looks like a lot, but it really isn't. As with most games of this sort, army building involves agreeing on a points total with your opponent and then buying units up to that value. The twist here is that you have a points value for your army and then you also have points to spend on your spell deck. Specifically, you have to take exactly 12 cards that cost less than 200 points. That being the case, each of the 5 factions in this box comprises a Planeswalker with 2 units adding up to 500 points and a 12 card spell deck adding up to 200 points. The problem there is obvious. Without any expansions, you get no army building options out of the box at all. You will always pick a Planeswalker, take the 2 units of that Planeswalker's colour, and then take the 12 spell cards of that colour. Clearly the idea was the game would expand, introducing new units and spells, allowing players to create exciting synergies between the miniatures on the board and the cards in their decks. But that's not there, out of the box. And even with the few expansions that were released for this game, and even though they did start introducing dual colour Planeswalkers that opened up more interesting options, that potential for army building and deck building was never fully realised. There's only so many times you can go into battle with the same Planeswalker, with the same spells and the same 2 units, and it's not many times. And that lack of variety bleeds into other aspects of the game as well, noticeably with the terrain. It's not necessarily that you don't get a lot of terrain, you just don't get enough to really demonstrate the game's mechanisms. You get 6 board tiles representing a sandy area with patches of water. You can configure these in numerous ways to make quite a few vaguely similar map layouts, but inexplicably, the boards aren't double-sided, which is such a waste. Nevertheless, I do prefer the boards to building maps out of HeroScape plastic tiles, because not only is it quick, it also means you get more value out of any tiles you do have. Rather than having to use a lot of tiles to build a big flat area, you can instead focus on using your tiles to build more interesting features like hills, cliffs and caves. Or at least, you would if you actually had the tiles to do it, because in this box you only get 2 3-hex tiles and 2 1-hex tiles. It's enough to make a little road bump, a molehill when you need a mountain. At least they did think to include some blocking terrain. You get 2 cardboard ruins. These are perfectly functional. Obviously plastic ruins would be nicer, but it's not an unreasonable concession to have card elements instead. Additionally, the box includes damage markers, 4 glyphs that are used as objectives in scenarios and provide special bonuses to your forces while you are controlling them, a d20 and the combat dice. The skulls may have been swapped for crossed swords, but they're still your good old-fashioned HeroScape dice, inspired by HeroQuest. Hits and blocks. So that's it for the contents, and it feels weird. The box is packed with stuff. You get 5 factions, 35 miniatures, 60 different spell cards, 6 map boards with ruins and plastic tiles, and yet despite all that, it doesn't feel like enough of anything. I know why they wanted 5 Planeswalkers in the box, but perhaps having fewer and giving each an extra unit would have gone a long way for improving initial impressions of the game. But let's talk more about the rules. I'm not going to labour the point here. It's basically HeroScape, so if you saw my video on how to play HeroScape, you already know the gist. There are a few obvious differences. Firstly, you now have a main character on the board in the form of the Planeswalker, an actual general who is at risk of dying and costing you the game. Then you have the spells, which you can play before moving a unit or after attacking with a unit. Finally, they ditched HeroScape's order token system, which allowed you to secretly decide which units would move and in which order, going for a much simpler system of moving just one of your units each turn. To get started, you select your faction colour, taking the units and spells associated with that faction, and you select one of the 3 scenarios in the back of the rules book. Here is another area where variety is lacking. There is 1 2-player scenario, 1 team-based scenario for 2 teams of 2 players, and then a free-for-all for 3 or more players. You build the map and then you place your Planeswalkers following the scenario instructions. Finally, each player draws a starting hand of 3 spell cards, and the game begins in a formalised round structure where each player takes a turn in a clockwise order. On a turn, you do 5 things. To start, you draw a spell card from your deck. You are allowed to play up to 3 spells per turn, and they fall into 2 categories. First, you have sorceries that you play for an instant effect and then discard, like this Sky Reaping spell from the green deck, which lets you inflict 1 damage on all flying creatures adjacent to one of the green creatures you control, and then draw a spell card. That spell would be great if it wasn't for the fact there are only 3 flying creatures in the game. The second type of spell is the enchantment, which you play onto one of your units to give them some kind of boost. Regular enchantments are played face up so everyone can see them. For example, this one here, Paths Revealed, simply gives the target unit +3 move. However, you also get hidden enchantments, and they remain a secret until they are triggered. For example, this Fog spell remains face down until the unit is attacked, at which point Fog is revealed, cancels all incoming damage, and then Fog is destroyed. The hidden enchantments are neat. I like that idea a lot. Unfortunately, it's again hampered by the limitations of a starter set, and I'm sorry I keep mentioning that, but I only have the starter set here, so the shortcomings are evident. The green deck, for example, only has 2 hidden enchantments. After 1 game, it's not going to take a lot for your opponents to figure out which spells you are using. Moving on, after drawing a spell card, you select a unit to activate. You just select one of the cards from your army. These cards look pretty different to the hex-shaped HeroScape ones, but they have most of the same information on them. Life points, movement, range of their attacks, number of dice they roll when attacking, and number of dice they roll when defending. Additionally, each unit has at least 1 special rule. Note that the cards have the same silhouettes as on HeroScape cards. These are used for determining true line of sight. You draw a line from the green dot on the attacker to any point of the target miniature. If that part of the miniature is dark grey on the silhouette, then you have line of sight and can attack. After selecting a unit, you can do 2 things. First, your Planeswalker can summon up to 2 of their units from reserves onto the board. If you are using just the starter set, that means dumping your whole army onto the board unless a unit benefits from being held back for a while. It's then possible to cast spells. You can cast up to 3 spells during any given turn. Next, you move your chosen unit. As in HeroScape, Units can move then attack, but cannot attack and then move, unless they have a special ability that says otherwise. Movement is by hex, with each move into an adjacent hex costing 1 movement. All the HeroScape rules apply for climbing up levels. For each level above your starting level, the move costs 1 additional point. Falling off levels, there is a risk of injury if you move down a number of levels equal to your height or greater, and not being able to use a unit to engage targets that are on a level equal to or greater than that unit's height. Only, none of those rules really matter unless you also play HeroScape, because you don't have enough tiles to make battlefields with lots of elevation. Next, your selected unit can attack. Your target has to be within range and line of sight. You roll your combat dice, remembering to take into account any bonuses from spells and abilities, and adding 1 extra dice if you are at a higher elevation than your target. And then you count up swords. Your target rolls defense and removes 1 sword for each shield they roll. Any remaining swords convert into wounds, which reduces the target's life total. After that attack, you have 1 more opportunity to cast spells, keeping in mind there is a limit of 3 spells per turn. Then you advance the turn tracker and the next player takes a turn. Continue until you fulfill the objective of your scenario. Now there are a few other rules to consider. Water impedes movement, some units cover 2 hexes, if you disengage from an enemy they get a free hit on you, and some scenarios include glyphs that provide bonuses for your team. But there's really not a lot of rules. As with HeroScape, the strategies and the depth are baked into the special abilities, which come not only from your units but from your spell decks. And I do think the spells are an interesting addition to the core HeroScape experience. I like having those extra options in hand. You aren't just relying on the abilities on your units, you have access to spells that will apply a buff to whichever unit needs it, or a way to play a sneaky enchantment that serves as a booby trap for an unwary opponent later in the game. It's a shame the game never found its legs. I can see the potential of the system. Would I have liked the game more if there had been more variety out of the box? I'm not sure. I do think spells give this an edge over HeroScape, and this iteration removes the order tokens which I never liked, so for me this is a more enjoyable experience, and it does get better if you can throw down some HeroScape hexes to add more interest to your battlefields. But, I don't know, I have a lot of great tabletop skirmish games in my collection, and I can't imagine I would have spent time and money investing into this one even if there had been a constant outpouring of new material for it. It's not a bad game, and I feel like I should have more fun with it than I do, but it just doesn't click with me. I guess that's hardly a surprising conclusion. This is basically HeroScape after all. But I think that's all I have to say about that. I think I'm going to go play God Tier, a hex-based skirmish game that I do enjoy a lot, considerably more than I enjoy this one. Let me know what you think in the comments, because that's it from me for now. If you liked the video, please consider pressing the like button. If you really like the video, please consider subscribing if you don't already do so. And hopefully, I'll see you all again very soon. Bye bye everyone. Bye bye.